You are on mute. Ira, you are on mute.
Oh, sorry. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Ira Mangunay Calvadores, and I am the coordinator of York University Emergency Mitigation Engagement Response and Governance Institute, or YEMERGE. I would like to officially open the the third session of the Emerging and Systemic Risks monthly lecture series co-organized by YEMERGE and CFAL York by reading our land acknowledgement. York University recognizes that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tikarondo has been taken care by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. With this, I would like to express my very warm welcome to our directors, moderators, speaker, and respected participants all over the world. Without further ado, I would like to hand the session to the Director of CFAL York, Associate Director of YEMERGE and Advanced Disaster Emergency and Rapid Response Simulation in York University, Dr. Ali Asghari.
Thank you very much, Ira, for the introduction. On behalf of Professor John Hong Wood, the Director of YEMERGE, and myself, I really would like to welcome all of you today. I know many of you participating from different parts of the world. Thank you for your time, considering that this is different time frame for you. We appreciate that. Our goal in YEMERGE and CFAL York for this speaker series is to bring together speakers, participants who are interested in critical examination of existing, emerging, and systemic risks. To start today, I would like to thank our speaker as well as moderator for taking the time to be with us. It's my great pleasure to introduce our moderator for this session, Professor Nirupama Agrawal, that I have had the honor to work as a colleague with her both at Brandon University, early 20s, and at York University since 2005. Dr. Nirupama Agrawal is a professor of disaster and emergency management and graduate program director at York University. She has a PhD in water resource engineering from Kyoto University. Her research areas include disaster risk management, physical dynamics of natural hazards, flood risk management using GIS and remote sensing techniques, and community resilience and adaptation to climate change. Dr. Agrawal's notable recent contribution, which is unique, is the textbook on natural disasters and risk management in Canada. Thank you again, Professor Nirupama Agrawal. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Asghari, for the kind introduction. Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. It is my pleasure and honor to welcome our distinguished guest speaker today, Professor Jason Van Medding. Professor Medding is an architect turned disaster researcher who centers the experiences, knowledge, and strengths of affected communities, focusing on how injustice and inequality underpin the creation of risk in society, profoundly shaping disaster impacts. He's an associate professor and a founding faculty member of the Florida Institute for Built Environment Resilience at the University of Florida, and devotes his research efforts to community-centered issues and processes related to disaster risk. He has a passion for communicating about disasters to the general public and encouraging other scientists to do the same, using mediums such as journalistic writing, podcasting, and filmmaking. Professor Medding, welcome. and the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. Let me see if this works. Let me know if you can still see my notes or I need to switch.
Yes, we see your notes.
Okay, should be
Perfect.
okay. All right.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. Yeah, thank you all so much, Professor Agrawal and other professors from York and everybody joining us today for being here, for the invitation. Previously, I was part of CFAL in Newcastle in Australia where I worked. So it's a network that I have a relationship with. I'm joining you from Gainesville, Florida, where I'm a settler on the ancestral territory of the Patano and Seminole peoples. Land acknowledgements are really important to me. It helps to center my thinking on the relationships I've inherited and my responsibilities to learn and act in ways that are critical of dominant Western and Eurocentric and colonial ways of seeing the world, seeing knowledge and seeing things like truth. And so, especially as a settler, and I think if we really want to talk about future risk, we need to listen to and be led by nations and peoples around the world that have a healthy relationship to land and other life on this planet. And that's not something that I think that I have been socialized into in my own culture. And so my first slide has a picture from a recent workshop in Jacksonville, Florida, where me and my team are part of a participatory action research collective studying infrastructure justice. In those conversations, oh, there we go. I realized my slide was wrong. But in those conversations in Jacksonville, vulnerability is really central to the discussions that we have, the experience of communities that I have relationships with there. And I'm sure many of you joining today have those kind of experiences of different narratives and stories in the communities that you work with as a scholar or practitioner. So I hope that something that I bring up today can help you to reflect or spark some discussion with the people that you are in relationship with. It's really exciting to be invited to talk about this theme. It's a chance to discuss emerging work that I've been doing with many colleagues and co-conspirators who I will enjoy crediting with a lot of the intellectual work here today. Something wrong with my PowerPoint. Give me 1 second. Does it look okay, Ira?
Yes, but we see your notes also. Yeah.
You don't see the notes then?
It's
Okay.
good. It's good.
Sorry, my PowerPoint crashed. In any case, something I'd like for you to do, there's a QR code on the screen. If anybody in attendance would like to participate in this, please just scan the QR code and answer the question that is prompting you. What other words come to mind when you think of vulnerability? And I want to start off with this. We'll come back to it later, and I'll show you the results of this activity later on. And it's going to hopefully be interesting just to maybe show some of the things that are kind of dominant in your thinking when you use this concept, as I'm sure many of us here in this room do. Like, what is it? How do you translate it into other languages? I'm sure many of us work between multiple languages. And when you use disaster concepts in different languages, they don't always mean the same thing, right? And we sometimes are translating back and forth to English, losing or obscuring meaning. And so it's important to reflect about what it means to you. And when we use the concept of vulnerability, we're usually talking about other people, people who are often oppressed or marginalized or feel the impacts of different injustices and inequalities. So who is vulnerable? Who comes to mind as being vulnerable? Is this something that we need to avoid? That's kind of prominent in my thinking when I started to really reflect on my usage of the term. So a little bit about me. I started off as an architect in 2000 in architecture school, and it's what I always wanted to do as a kid. And my first introduction to research was really Hurricane Katrina, and I approached that very much as a designer. But through that process of talking to people affected by disaster, learning that disasters were more than the interaction of people and hazards, it was actually, they were political, they were social, risk was socially constructed. All of that was kind of new to me. So that got me really interested in this interdisciplinary field of disaster studies. And so from being really focused on being a designer, I shifted towards a scientific career, and I really love it, and I'm glad I did. Another thing that shifted for me was, alongside this further investigation of literature and philosophical thinking, I realized that I was someone who really relied on certainty, and who had a lot of certainty in what I thought and what my opinions were. And the further that I've grown into this field, into my own work, I've realized how uncertain I am about things and how that's not necessarily a bad thing. So vulnerability and thinking about vulnerability means we need to think about what theory is there in hazards and disasters research. It's an interdisciplinary field. There's lots of different frameworks out there, but this one will probably be familiar to you. Pressure and release framework, and thinking about this disaster risk is hazards, vulnerability, capacity, and social protection, or some formula to that effect. And really the PAR framework was a way that the field has tried to focus people's attention on the root causes of disaster. And so the creation of vulnerability is something that is rooted in social and political injustices and inequalities. And this has been I think, a really powerful framework, and is usually something that most people writing about vulnerability in disasters are linking to. And you might call it using a vulnerability lens. And so I would say my approach to this was definitely through this lens, definitely through thinking about inequality and injustice. But the more time I spent in this field, the more I realized that efforts to reduce vulnerability by focusing people on root causes have not really led to system change, and have usually inspired more humanitarian responses than responses rooted in solidarity and community action. And vulnerability itself is originating from this idea of wounding. And so the critique of the usage of vulnerability is usually goes something like this. It's, it has a colonial heritage. It promotes unequal power relationships. It's kind of, the critique is rooted in development studies, and how vulnerability has been used to label people and work in favor of neoliberal interests, and has actually made people less able to deal with risk. So vulnerability, the critique of vulnerability is usually critiquing the usage of vulnerability. So if we think about vulnerability, who are we thinking about? We're usually, those of us in hazards and disasters are usually thinking about those people who are out of sight, out of reach, out of the loop, out of money, out of scope, or marginalized based on different identities. And all of these ways of thinking about the so-called vulnerable may be useful in practical terms, you know, when we're organizing programs or research projects. But indeed, like us deciding what vulnerability means and giving it a definition, what I've said here, this naming, labeling, and framing are actually expressions of power relations as well. And how often do we interrogate what vulnerability means to people who we are labeling? And so I think we need to really be aware of different meanings, of different experiences, different kind of choices and needs and preferences in terms of how people want to be acknowledged, and some of the damaging ways that labels are used. Vulnerability itself is a Western concept, and so we need to be careful about how it can be abused. And one of the scholars that I always look to in this regard is Greg Bankoff. Some of you will have read his work, and he has a really great paper that's super useful if you're looking into this about vulnerability as a Western concept. And so Greg Bankoff has been one of those who was pretty critical of, you know, At Risk, the book, and the way vulnerability was being used. And it's a useful setting off point if you're thinking about how vulnerability can be used in damaging ways and some critiques of it. So again, what is vulnerability to you? For me, the more I got into this, I thought about, well, in the disaster field, vulnerability is used in this sort of normative way. So for me, it's become more and more important to question anything normative in my field, because it's a field that brings together people from all different disciplines, all different experiences, all different levels of education when you're doing community research, all different kind of violences and oppressions. And so in those teams that I'm working in, those kind of networks I'm moving within, we need to question normativity, because normativity, it can be very damaging. And so I started to notice oppressive usages of the concept of vulnerability. And because it has many meanings, I started to wonder, alongside other concepts like resilience, whether standardization is actually useful or whether it's doing more harm than good. And it caused me to really dive into other ways of reading vulnerability in the literature, especially feminist literature on vulnerability. Perry Cannon also argues that vulnerability is one of the most used and abused concepts in disaster scholarship. And the vulnerability paradigm itself has really tried to urge us away from hazard-centric approaches that focus on technical solutions. But it has well-documented limitations. A part of our field that I think has done a really good job of this is disaster anthropology, especially Marina and Fass. And if you want to read into their work on vulnerability, I think it's really useful. The overarching problem is vulnerability being portrayed as a weakness. And that's something I'm going to pick up on in some of the work I'm going to share with you. Portraying vulnerability as a weakness implies that it's something bad and something that we need to reduce. In the context of disasters, vulnerability is often used in contrast to resilience, although there's a lot of literature that's kind of really grappling with the differences and in those concepts and the way that they're not kind of the inverse of each other. Erin Gilson, I put in a quote here about from one of her papers, which really spoke to me and changed the way I looked at things, thinking about the way we often look at vulnerability and say, well, we need to react to this harm that's being done by being invulnerable and achieving mastery over vulnerability. And so, yeah, Erin Gilson writes about this idea of mastery is sought at the price of disavowing vulnerability, absolutely, which, as I'll talk about, is problematic. So my first kind of foray into really thinking about this through a lot of time I think through my writing. And so one of the first things I did was to work with Mayor Heidi Harman, who was the mayor of San Luis Obispo in California for several years. But she's a friend of mine, and we decided to write this essay in Open Democracy. And it was around the time of the first COVID lockdowns, and we had a lot of we noticed a lot of sort of authoritarian style leaders around the world who were posturing in this sort of to kind of say or project that they were invulnerable and that they weren't scared of COVID. And so our essay was really inspired by our discussions about like what we were seeing in the news and how like not wearing a mask became a virtue signal in a perverse way and a real patriarchal projection of strength. And we just started to talk about how that contrasted with feminist framings of vulnerability. And we started to talk about how vulnerability by choice is really the only way that we can be in relationship with other human beings. How can we trust each other or be in relationship without mutually agreeing to be vulnerable with each other? And so that's kind of where we started off in 2020 talking about this. And building on that, in the year after that, I just started to work on a lot of like in my notebook, lots of diagrams about vulnerability and how to interact with different concepts. And eventually that led to another essay that I wrote in the Arrow Journal, which was really calling for a reframe of the concept of vulnerability, to think about it as a condition of potential. And I started to get into, in disaster studies, how resilience itself has often been something promoted to preserve the status quo, and something that is not actually helping to reduce risk, and how vulnerability is used to promote the same thing in the way that we label people, the way we react to vulnerability, in promoting like an individual lessening of vulnerability or ways of self-helping to be less vulnerable, but actually protecting the system and the systems and society that create risk. And so it's another essay that you could check out. It was really, again, a way of me figuring out a lot of the ideas about this in a less academic way, hopefully, and a more accessible way to reach different audiences, which is something I also am pretty passionate about. I finished in this article by, well, one thing I was talking about was about the idea of vulnerability being about openness to wounding. And the problem with the way that I think our field has looked at that openness to wounding is that we have only been able to see harm based coming out of that openness, rather than seeing opportunity to care for each other and to protect each other from wounding. And so closing ourselves off, not being open, also closes us off to those opportunities. So I finished in this essay saying that transformative change comes closer when we commit to and draw power from an interdependent relationship to each other and the world around us. Contesting resilience and reframing vulnerability is part of that struggle, end quote. And so that brings me to a couple of different more recent works that I've been involved in, which are all with other colleagues. And I want to talk to you a bit about those different projects and the papers that are either published or coming out that have helped me to progress my thinking about vulnerability. The first one is a research project with Joanne Jordan, and where we were actually researching other disaster researchers. And I don't know who's in the audience exactly, but there might be some folks listening in that were part of this research. And we really appreciate all of the researchers and authors that spend time with us talking about how they tell stories of vulnerability. So we're currently writing up that project, writing up a paper on that. The second one is a project with Ksenia Chmutina, Darian Alexander Williams, Carly Purdom, and Jamie Vickery. And we were looking at the securitization of vulnerability. I'm gonna share some of the findings from that paper, which is available now if you would like to read it. And the third piece is currently awaiting a decision. It's been through review in Disasters Journal, and we're just, sorry, it's in DPM. Disasters Journal is that second piece, but the third piece is in DPM. And it's a theoretical piece with Ksenia Chmutina. And we've really progressed our thinking to a theory of vulnerability. And yeah, I'm looking forward to sharing that with you in a few moments. So the first study was really conceived of as a reflection between Joanne and I on the practice of telling stories of the vulnerability of other people. So we started off by talking together about, like, how do we tell stories in an ethical way? And the further we got into that discussion and starting to write about it, we really thought it would be way more interesting and rich to bring in other disaster researchers using the vulnerability paradigm to in their work, and to do research on that group of scholars that is in this working in this space. And so we wanted to look at the ethics of disaster research was a big focus. Also, the types of knowledge and who owns the knowledge, and how knowledge is prioritized was another thing that we were interested in, and also the power imbalances that existed between people who were labeled as vulnerable and those who are writing about that vulnerability. And so in that study, from March until May last year, we undertook 7 focus group discussions with 26 disaster researchers. Each of them lasted about 2 hours. And these are the questions that we were asking. I won't read them all out, but they were trying to get into discussions of those themes that I just mentioned. Talking about different responsibilities that we have, the experiences that those scholars had and some of the strategies that they use to really to tell authentic stories, to make sure that they are behaving ethically as a scholar. One of the key things that came out of those focus groups was a lot of findings about representation of others and about the construction of knowledge. So some of the things that we found there were about, our own complicity in the creation of risk, and our need to be reflexive in the research process and realize when it's our voice that's being projected and how to decenter ourselves. A lot of talk about truth and narrative and labeling, and it all kind of came back to this idea of subjectivity, and also a discussion of power as well, and about Western discourses, about the institutions that many of us represent, and how invested they are in certain systems and in certain relations with communities, and how many of us as disaster researchers have different values and are actually sometimes working subversively against those interests. The second big area of findings for us was around this real diversity of opinion that emerged around bias and values, and again, subjectivity, and how as a writer, as a facilitator of research, as a storyteller, can you create space for this diversity and conflict and things to emerge in your stories that are not, clear and clean and easy, but be comfortable with the discomfort. And we also talked just about individually, like as researchers, how your own identity and experiences and beliefs and culture informs the way that you filter stories from the field. The third major theme coming out of that was around power, trust, and ownership, talking a lot about who the story is benefiting, who labeling is benefiting, what happens when you tell these stories or when you create these labels, and very different responses from the research community on how to deal with ethical dilemmas that emerge in storytelling. Sometimes some folks in our field, choose not to tell certain stories because they don't have permission. And so we talked about some really interesting dilemmas that people come and have to deal with in their research, in their practice. And finally, we also found major narratives emerging around solidarity, empathy, and connection, and about the need to really get serious about creating benefits for participation for those who are the so-called vulnerable, and also thinking about creating real action or finding ways to be part of change through stories. And some of that is around like the means that we use to communicate. So are we just publishing these stories in a place where, even the people who told the stories will never read them? Are they accessible? Are we doing the hard work to make sure that the right people hear the story? So it's really about engagement, communication, and how do we upskill ourselves in these areas that we might not have been trained in order to do more ethical work. So the second study I want to talk about is work that I did with Ksenia, Darian, Jamie, and Carly. It's a paper in Disasters Journal. You can find it on their Securitization of Vulnerability. And we were really looking at these 4 different groups of people that are labeled as vulnerable, but they are they're usually pitied, and they're kind of portrayed as weak or threatened or in need of help. But we wanted to look at the times in which the state creates a counter narrative where these groups are turned into people who are feared and hated. And so a narrative is created, a process is undertaken where these people become a threat. And so why does this happen and how is it possible? And we framed the paper around securitization theory, and would love if you all wanted to engage or read that in Disasters Journal. Turning the vulnerable into a threat, it was a really interesting concept to start to think about. We started from, the point of view, we're all disaster researchers in different ways, and vulnerability is usually used as a something to inspire pity, but it's very reactive. And so pity as a starting point for engagement is generally where we're at, but it leads to kind of humanitarian responses, and we've talked about the issues with that. But in this paper, we looked at cases where pity is withdrawn, and from those individuals or groups, and how that person is othered and set outside of like normal. And so in that way, they're framed as undeserving of protection. And indeed, often these people and groups are deemed as fit for punishment and disposable. So the process of securitization, we started to think about this, and we started to think about how, vulnerable people, quote unquote, are not explicitly included in policy as a threat, but we were able to look at with these other four groups how that process is unfolding, and how by proxy, the people who are seen as vulnerable are seen as threatening. And the steps of securitization theory is identification of a threat to an object. That object could be, social cohesion. It could be the national economy, something that's important to the state. Step two is prescription of a plan of action in relation to that threat. And then step three is when that threat becomes a part of political agenda. And so it's really about developing a narrative that allows dehumanization and disidentification of the vulnerable, seeing somebody as other and less morally worthy. And so maybe some instances come to mind when you see that happening in your own work. I'm having a PowerPoint close down again. Give me 1 second. Okay, hopefully we're back. So yeah, so this kind of action is usually taken by a state in a climate of fear, for political expediency, for preserving the status quo of the state. And we really thought through this paper about who deserves protection, who decides why people should have protection, and the way in which a lot of times oppressed peoples or people experiencing violence or marginalization, their refusal to obey is often seen as a way, or is seen as a reason to withdraw that protection. And so in those cases, vulnerability becomes viewed as a threat. So please check out that paper in Disasters Journal if you get a chance. The third strand of work that I just wanted to briefly talk about was a theorizing discussion that goes back a couple of years between Ksenia and I, who also hosts a podcast that some of you may have listened to before. but we've been looking at a theory for disaster studies of vulnerability reframed. And because we feel vulnerability has more potential than it's being realized in our field. We don't want to come out with like some new dogma about vulnerability, but we feel that it's being underutilized, underappreciated, and there's components of vulnerability or meanings or uses of vulnerability that could be helpful in the science that we are all doing. We believe it should be a important concept in relation to resistance and solidarity in disaster recovery. And so over a series of different writing sessions on Zoom, we developed this theory, and it's currently in the review process for Disaster Prevention Management Journal. I'll just show you a few of the things that we've been working on in this paper, and that hopefully you'll be able to read soon in DPM. This is our look at the intersection of agency and power orientation, and looking at the different ways that vulnerability can be conceptualized by, where people are on those spectrums, from individual to collective, and from power within to power over. And in the paper, we outlined what it would mean to have combinations of those different characteristics towards power and agency. The next thing that we interrogated was how do people or groups respond to vulnerability? And we really argue in the paper that our responses to vulnerability are ideological, and vary from those that are rooted in ignorance or willful ignorance, to those that respond by trying to draw on the concept of resilience or build resilience, and those that resist and that really hone in on oppression and how the system needs to change. And the right side of that diagram really indicates how we feel that these orientation or these ideological responses can lead to different actions. They can lead to actions that just accept the vulnerability, actions that suggest some sort of reforming of the system, and actions that are like all-out disobedience. Another thing we looked at in this paper was about autonomy and social hierarchy. Again, we looked at these spectrums from care to compliance in terms of autonomy that people have, and from a social hierarchy that's distributed to one that's hierarchical. And we developed kind of an explanation of all these different quadrants that we talk about in the paper. Again, don't really have time to get into this, but hopefully it'll be upcoming soon in the journal. And we finished off the paper looking at how we can use these discussions and these critiques of different aspects of our society through the lens of vulnerability to actually develop actions, actually develop something useful for people to organize around. And we call it pathways towards liberation. And yeah, we looked at like, how do we get towards something, again, another kind of complex term, but transformation, and transformation through resistance rather than resilience building, because resilience building is usually what we're encouraged to embrace. And I think sometimes resilience itself has really been co-opted into the status quo. Not to say that resilience isn't sometimes used in really productive and disobedient ways, because I know that it is. But the status quo way of using resilience is certainly not getting us towards transformation anytime soon. So I want to finish up just to say that some of the theoretical conclusions from these works that we've been involved in, me and my collaborators, are that vulnerability as conceived right now in our field we found was sort of non-ideological. And in some ways, although it had great intentions, it was doing a lot of work of depoliticization and masking power relationships and obscuring the potential that vulnerability has, which has been revealed in other fields of scholarship. And we tried to focus in this work on how the oppressed, people who are marginalized, people who are abandoned, are already out there creating different worlds and changing their world. And that the vulnerable show us what love and care and solidarity really look like every time they face disaster impacts. And I'm sure that will resonate with those of you who work with disaster affected people. And so for us, using theory that kind of promotes an apolitical agenda is not acting in solidarity with those people who are trying to change the world. And we're hoping that these kind of theoretical discussions debates, arguments, I don't know what we're going to have around all this work, but we're hoping that it really is productive and it really helps us to get to what is important and how do we change conditions of oppression in communities or support people who are already changing those conditions. And one of my favorite authors is Eduardo Galeano. And I love this quote that says, unlike solidarity, which is horizontal and takes place between equals, charity is top-down, humiliating those who receive it and never challenging the implicit power relations. And that kind of gets to the core of why I find our normative approach to vulnerability disturbing and sometimes just not what people need, not the best way that I can be of assistance or useful when I'm dealing with people who are labeled this way. So at the end, when I finish up, I'm going to flash up on the screen some of the results of the survey that I did. I'll flash up a word cloud. And just as we go away, maybe encourage you to reflect further on how you think about vulnerability, how you see people who are labeled vulnerable, how you label people perhaps. And beyond there, think about other terms that you use in your work, such as resilience, capacity, strength. How are those words, how do you use them? How are they useful? I think it's all about how we frame stories, and that's why it's so important, because language is fluid. Language is fluid, and so by creating these kind of normative understandings of something, it may help us to save time, may help us to take quicker action, but it can be damaging. So just to be aware of that. And I love the way Judith Butler talks about framing in her work. Some of the things to take away here: tell better stories, help to shift the paradigm. I think we all have different positions or communities that we're in where we have an opportunity to speak about these issues. And so when we're speaking of vulnerable, I just encourage everybody to take care and think about how you're using language. Work with others towards collective action, and be a reflective practitioner. Spend time considering your own positionality. And just in closing, maybe it's not really about what vulnerability means, but just how we use it. And normative definitions, I don't think will do when we're dealing with issues that are so important and require system change. So let's be intentional about how we use vulnerability and other words and concepts. And I think for me anyway, that's going to allow me to repoliticize the stories that I'm speaking about and the actions that I take. So thank you all for listening today and for being here. And I'm happy to engage about any of these issues. You can contact me by email, Twitter, anything you like. And yeah, open to some questions if we still have a bit of time.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Madding. That was incredibly insightful and deep and theoretical. I have one question here, which I'll read it out to you. To what degree do you think the vulnerable are othered, or people or groups who are othered because of race, identity, nationality, religion, or ethnicity are made vulnerable?
I mean, it's very context specific. So I would say that that looks differently where you are. It's very much depends on policy, but also on social relations. So I think in most places in the world, there's usually some mechanism at play, which is othering some individuals or groups within a society. And I think that has a large part to play in creating these conditions of inequality and injustice between people, between groups. Sometimes that looks like, you know, state-led violence. Sometimes it's more intercommunal. But I think there's lots of different ways that these mechanisms create what we would call risk, and that's coming from creation of vulnerabilities. Hopefully, you know, all of the work we've been doing is not to argue that like we shouldn't try to reduce harm, but it's arguing that, you know, these harmful conditions exist, and we aren't going to reduce it by becoming like more closed. Is kind of the argument that we're making. But we will be able to oppose and resist those conditions of harm that are creating harm and violence by becoming closer together, and by, you know, those like somebody like me who's a white man who's a settler in this country, becoming closer to people who are oppressed in this country, and, you know, by developing relationship, by being together, will develop ways to oppose systems of oppression, you know, that might not affect me, but they'd certainly affect people I'm working with.
Mm-hmm. If I could, oh, there is more questions here. So there's another one. The current discourse of developments versus ecological balance is very much the cause of hazards, turning in disasters, more common in global south. How does one counter the political and media narratives to prioritize the human angle towards vulnerable during a post-disaster phase?
So hopefully I understand this question correctly. But, you know, it's the idea that we need development in order to promote well-being, and we need to promote, you know, human progress, but it's counter to ecological needs or to environmental needs. Is that how you understand it?
I think it's very subjective. You can
okay,
take
well,
it, and yeah, you can take it in any direction.
Yeah, that's how I would think about how the question is posed. And I think, like, for me, it comes back to the dominant economic paradigm, which is capitalism, and that we think of development within that paradigm generally. And of course, there's other systems that are still active in the world, but that's a dominant system. And that system is very destructive for the ecology. One book that I read recently was Decolonial Ecology, Malcolm Ferdinand, which is a wonderful book, but looks at how, you know, Black and Indigenous knowledges are the only way out of our ecological catastrophe, because within Western Eurocentric Northern paradigms, we have a very destructive relationship to land and to the environment, and it's very hard to see how we're going to change course within those paradigms, we need to listen to people who have better relationship to land and to other life on the earth in order to figure out a way forward.
Mm-hmm. So I see that the question was asked by Shahzad. Do you want to speak to it? My colleague, the first question was from David Atkin, my colleague. Anybody, if they wanted to speak to their question or follow up. While we wait, I'm curious about something you mentioned. The vulnerability actually has the potential for resilience building, and so I was struck by that because last night I was driving from Waterloo late at night, and the CBC radio was playing these ideas, and it was very interesting. The failure is the new success in the 21st century, because if you don't fail, you don't succeed. And I thought there was this connection between what you are saying. Vulnerability has the potential for resilience building and also adaptation, etc. So that is the same focus. Can I just add to that you're talking about vulnerability all in a one bucket, like social, economic, physical, health, all kinds of vulnerabilities are out there. Are you talking about just the vulnerability, or any of those things?
Yeah, I mean, that's another level of complexity for this, is the way that vulnerability has been used in combination with other words, to indicate different types of system that are vulnerable, right? And so I think when we're doing a lot of this work, it's more thinking about vulnerability as a human condition. So it closest to what you might see as social vulnerability.
Yeah. So that's that. And also when you say we think, we meaning researchers, or are saying we meaning the developed world, which is only 20% of the population?
Yeah, usually when I'm saying we, I'm talking about me and collaborators on the work in the last years. Yeah. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe I used we in a more broader term. I'm not sure.
Fair enough. So do we still have time? I'll hand it over to our host, Dr. Asghari.
Thank you very much, Jason and Nirupam. It was great learning, listening to all the work that you have done. I just want to ask Professor Wu to close the sessions with a few words.
Thank you, Ali. And I'm Jianheng Wu, the director of the Emerge, or York Emergency Mitigation Engagement Response and Governance Institute. We're very happy to co-organize this lecture series along with CIFA and a research cluster in the subject area. Our aim is really to provide a platform for exchange of the current thinking about the emergency mitigation, engagement, response, and governance. And this session today really served its purposes very well. I would like to thank Professor Van Melding for this wonderful lecture, and I would like to thank my colleague Niro, Professor Agua, for coordinating these sessions. And I want to thank you all for joining us today, and best wishes for all of you.